Welcome back, friends, to the Royal Public Library's virtual story time. My name is Mr. Derek, and today we're going to tell you some stories that were originally written by Beatrix Potter. Do you know who Beatrix Potter was? Here at the library we actually have a statue of Beatrix Potter. And Beatrix Potter was an English writer, an illustrator, and she was also a conservationist. Now, conservationists work with the environment, and they are particularly, what they do is they act or they advocate on behalf of the environment to help ensure that things like you have clean water and clean air, that the animals are taken care of, that the trees are taken care of. So their job, kind of, as a conservationist, is to help make sure that the environment is safe to live in for both people and animals. And so that's what Beatrix Potter was interested in. She was interested in nature and learning about trees and animals and the environment. And she was also interested in art. And so by writing children's books, she was able to combine both her interest in art and science, and she was able to tell some stories that were really important. Lots of people read Beatrix Potter stories. And here at the library, we actually have a lot of Beatrix Potter stories. So these are some of the ones we have. We have, for example, The Tale of Peter Rabbit. And we have the tale about his cousin, Benjamin Bunny. We have the tale of Jemima Puddle Duck. And so these are all really cool, fun stories about animals doing interesting things, sometimes being a little bit bad and sometimes being a little bit good. But they're animals and they do fun things. Let's see. Here at the library, if you're interested in learning about her life, it's a very interesting life, I encourage you to check out this juvenile biography that we have here down on the kids' side, The Country Artist, a story about Beatrix Potter. And it tells about some of her life. Here's a drawing. This is a picture of Beatrix. She was a girl, and that's her dog. Do you know what her name was? The dog's name was Spot. So that's her and her dog Spot. She loved animals, and she loved nature. And it kind of, that's what was her inspiration for the stories, was her love of nature and her love of science. And she was born in the 1800s, and she wrote her first book in 1902. So she was writing these stories a long time ago. But the stories are really important, and people still read them today, and you can check them out here at the library today, or whenever you would like. If you're interested in Beatrix Potter, learning about it, check out The Country Artist, and that biography is by David R. Collins, or request some of the books she wrote. You can even request a bundle if you're interested. If you're wanting to know more about Beatrix, just say, hey, could you guys check out all the Beatrix Potter books to me. I'd like to study her style. And so we have a lot of her most important ones. And if you want just an anthology of her stories, we have this. And these are some of the good stories. But for those of you who are new to Beatrix Potter, we've got a treat for you today, because I'm going to go tell you the story of The Tale of Peter Rabbit. And on Thursday, I'm going to tell you the story of The Two Bad Mice. So enjoy those and have fun. So once upon a time, there were 4 little bunnies, and they lived with their mom underneath a fir tree. The 4 bunnies' names were Mopsy, Topsy, Flopsy, and of course, Peter. Now, Flopsy, Mopsy, and Topsy, they were good little bunnies, but Peter, he was a little bit naughty. Now, one day his mom wanted to go to the store, and so she got all of her little bunny children around, and she said, I'm going to go to the store, and I'm going to go pick you up some dinner, but you have to be very careful, because I do not want you to go past the field into McGregor's garden. Do not go into McGregor's garden. And all the little bunnies were sitting and listening, except Peter. He wasn't really listening too much. And Peter had his arms crossed, and he said, why not? And his mom said, well, because your dad went into Mr. McGregor's garden, and he got put into a pot pie. And so I don't want any of my children to be put into a pot pie, a rabbit pot pie. So don't go into McGregor's garden, because he doesn't like rabbits in his garden. Well, Mopsy, Flopsy, and Topsy, they're like, and they were scared because their mom had warned them, and they listened to their mom. But Peter had his arms crossed still. You're just trying to scare us, he said. And so his mom decided to go off to the store to go get them their dinner. And Mopsy, Topsy, and Flopsy and Peter went outside. Mopsy, Topsy, and Flopsy made sure that they stayed by the field. And they were picking blackberries. And Peter started out with Mopsy, Flopsy, and Topsy. But when they weren't looking, he worked away from them. And then guess where he decided to go? Yep, Peter Rabbit decided to go to Mr. McGregor's garden. He went up, and so he ran across the field, and then finally there it was, Mr. McGregor's garden, and he saw the gate. And Peter noticed that he could squeeze underneath the gate, so he walked over to the gate. He looked around. He didn't see any Mr. McGregor, so he went underneath the gate, and all of a sudden he saw all the vegetables that were around in Mr. McGregor's garden. He saw the cucumbers and the tomatoes. He saw the carrots. He saw the radishes. And he saw the lettuce. Now rabbits, they really like salad. I don't know if you knew that. So to Peter, this was awesome. He thought, wow, all my favorite food right here in this garden. So he started pulling out the carrots and he started eating them. And nom nom nom. And he was eating the carrots. And he was eating the radishes. And he was eating the lettuce. And he was really excited. He ate so much, in fact, that he started to feel a little bit sick. Now, he had heard that if you eat parsley after your tummy feels bad, it might help settle your tummy. So he decided to go look for some parsley. Parsley is just an herb that grows in gardens. And he knew that in Mr. McGregor's garden there must be some parsley growing somewhere. So he began to look around, trying to find some parsley, because he ate so much that his tummy started to hurt. So he was looking around for some parsley, and then all of a sudden, he goes around the corner, and guess who he sees? He sees Mr. McGregor. Mr. McGregor was working on planting some cabbages. And Mr. McGregor saw Peter, and all of a sudden he jumped up. He threw his rake down on the ground, and he pointed his finger at Peter, and he said, "Stop thief!" And then with the stomping of feet, he started running right towards little Peter Rabbit. Well, Peter Rabbit was really scared, so Peter Rabbit started running. He ran as fast as he could. But unfortunately, he ran so fast that he accidentally got caught in the net that Mr. McGregor had put up to catch rabbits. And so now Peter Rabbit, he was wearing a sweater that's a lot like mine. And it had buttons. It had big buttons like this. See? Now, his big buttons had gotten stuck in the net and he couldn't get out. And he was wailing and trying to get out, and he felt stuck. And then he thought, I need to just give up because I can't get out. Now some sparrows who had been flying by, they saw Peter Rabbit laying there, and they flew down. And they said, Peter, you have to get up. If Mr. McGregor catches you, he's going to put you in a pot pie. You have to get up. And so Peter struggled even more to try to get out. Well, all of a sudden, he saw Mr. McGregor, and Mr. McGregor saw him, stuck in the net. Mr. McGregor laughed. "Ha ha ha ha, I've got you now," he said. And he walked over, and Peter was struggling even more to get out. And all of a sudden, Peter ripped out of his jacket, his sweater, and he barreled away. He ran as fast as he could. He finally got out. Just as Mr. McGregor was about to grab him, he escaped. So Mr. McGregor was starting to get irritated, and Peter was running away. And Peter ran right into the tool shed, and he was looking around for a place to hide, because Mr. McGregor was running right behind him. And all of a sudden he noticed that there was a watering can that Mr. McGregor used to water his plants. And so Peter went and he jumped up and he popped right into the watering can. He didn't know there was water inside of it, and it was cold water, but he needed to be very quiet so that Mr. McGregor didn't see him. Mr. McGregor followed in behind him, and he was looking around in the tool shed trying to figure out where Peter had went, because he knew Peter was in his tool shed. But he didn't know he had gone inside the watering can. And so he's looking everywhere. He was looking everywhere. And then all of a sudden, Peter, who was very cold and wet, he sneezed. Achoo! And all of a sudden, Mr. McGregor knew exactly where Peter was. Mr. McGregor kicked over the watering can, and out came Peter. Now, Mr. McGregor was about to stomp on little Peter with his boot, but Peter was too fast for him, and he ran out a little window as fast as he could, and he got away from Mr. McGregor. So Peter was outside the tool shed, and Mr. McGregor didn't see where he went to, so he was safe again, but he still couldn't get out of Mr. McGregor's garden, and he felt lost. Well, he went and he was looking around the garden, and then he saw a pond where Mr. McGregor gets his water from. So the pond was where Mr. McGregor got his watering can, and he put his watering can down into the pond to get water for his plants. And by the pond, he noticed that there was a cat, and the cat was looking down at the goldfish in the pond. And the cat was staying very still. And he was just looking down at the fish. And the only thing that moved was his tail. It twitched occasionally. But nothing else moved on the cat. And its eyes were focused on the little goldfish that were inside the pond. Peter Rabbit didn't know much about cats. But his cousin, Benjamin Bunny, had told him that he'd better watch out for cats because cats like to pick on little rabbits. So Peter decided not to talk to the cat. So he went on, and he found a wall, and there was a door on the wall, and there was a little mouse. And the mouse was going underneath the door, and he was getting food. And he was carrying little beans outside of the house. He was going out into the door, and he was coming out of the door, and he was carrying little beans from inside the house to carry out to his family who lived out in the woods. And Peter was hoping that the mouse would know how to get out of the garden. "Mouse, wait," he said, as the mouse slid under the door. The mouse poked its head out from under the door, and Peter said, "I need to get out of here. Can you tell me, how do I get out of this garden?" And the mouse looked at him, and the mouse's mouth was full of beans. So he just looked at him like this. And Peter thought that the mouse just wasn't wanting to talk to him. So Peter started to cry, and he started to feel sad because he felt lost in the garden and he couldn't get out. Peter decided to go back to the tool shed. And so Peter walked to the tool shed, and he noticed that there was a wheelbarrow that was by the tool shed. And then he had an idea. You know what I could do? He thought. I could climb on top of the wheelbarrow, and that will help me see where the gate is so I can get out of this garden. And so really quietly, Peter climbed up on the wheelbarrow, and then he began to look around. And he could see out over all the garden. Can you do that? Put your hand over your eyes like this and look out all over the garden. Peter saw Mr. McGregor, and he was back working on his plants again. He was planting his cabbages. But he had his back turned, so he didn't see Peter Rabbit up on the wheelbarrow. But more importantly, Peter saw where the gate was. So that gave Peter an idea. So Peter, very quietly, he pointed himself in the direction of the gate, and then very, very quietly, he climbed down from the wheelbarrow. And then aiming himself in the direction of the gate, he started running as fast as he could. And he was running right towards the gate with the thumping of feet. Now, Mr. McGregor saw him running, and he was about to go get his rake so he could go hit Peter before he could get out, but Mr. McGregor was too slow for him. Peter was already by the gate, and then with a slide, he was underneath the gate and out in the woods, and he was safe, and he was away from Mr. McGregor's garden. Well, Peter was so scared, and he was so thankful that he had gotten out of the garden that he did not look back. He kept running as fast as he could back to his home underneath the fir tree with his mom and his brothers and sisters, Flopsy, Topsy, and Mopsy. When he got back home, he flopped down right on the sand. It was a very soft sand underneath the fir tree, and he flopped down and he started sleeping. His mom got back a couple minutes later, and she saw Peter flopped down on the sand. And she noticed that he was missing his coat, his blue coat. She said. That's the second coat that Peter has lost in a week. Now, Peter was very, very tired. Mopsy, Topsy, and Flopsy, they had gathered blackberries, and their mom gave them bread and milk. And that night, Mopsy, Topsy, and Flopsy had blackberries and milk and bread, and they enjoyed their dinner. But she put Peter to bed so that he could have chamomile tea and so that he could get rest. So while they were eating the blackberries and the bread and the milk, he was resting in bed with chamomile tea. The end.